By sunrise on a raw Thursday in November of 1993, Colin Doyle had already watched two modern recovery trucks fail, and his refrigerated trailer was still sinking into the harbor mud with 40,000 pounds of cod inside it. The trailer hadn't rolled, the driver wasn't hurt. Nothing dramatic had happened, in the way people usually mean dramatic. A rig loaded for the morning run to St. John's had eased 8 inches too far off the shell-packed edge of the service lane behind the Crown Point fish plant, and that was enough. The right-side drives of Colin's 1985 Kenworth settled through the shoulder. Then the trailer tandems followed. Then the whole combination leaned just enough to tell every man standing there the same ugly truth. This was no longer a driving problem. This was a ground problem. Colin Doyle was 41 years old, and he had spent 13 seasons building Doyle Sea Transport from one borrowed reefer and a favor from his cousin at the plant, into 6 trucks, 3 standing contracts, and a reputation for never missing a cold load handoff. Not once. In his business, the fish did not care about your excuses. Ice, schedules, buyers, ferries, processors. All of it moved on time, or it moved without you. And now his best unit was parked in black tidal silt like it had been lowered there on purpose. Before you understand why the next part mattered, you need to understand what he had already tried, and what the harbor mud was doing to every expensive answer. He called Bain's Recovery out of Clarenville 20 minutes after the driver radioed in. Todd Baines showed up with a heavy rotator before noon, backed onto the service lane, set his outriggers, rigged to the tractor, and put tension in the line. For a few hopeful seconds, the Kenworth shivered, and Colin thought that might be enough. It wasn't. The rotator's rubber tires skated on the wet concrete cap. The outriggers bit through the top crust and found fill that had been softening under 3 days of rain and a week of high tides. And every time Todd pulled harder, the truck moved, but not where Colin needed it to move. The nose twitched, the rear settled. The mud closed tighter around the axles. Todd backed off and said the kind of sentence men say when they can feel a job sliding out of the category of skill and into the category of damage. "I can move it," he said, "but not from here, and not like this." They tried again on Wednesday with a second unit and more timber under the outriggers. Same result. The old wharf lane flexed. The top surface looked solid, but the fill beneath it behaved like soaked meal. By afternoon, Todd had stopped sounding like a recovery operator and started sounding like an accountant. He told Colin he could bring in a crane from street, better tide cycle, build a proper platform, and maybe have the truck back on the lane in 4 or 5 days. 4 or 5 days. Colin did the arithmetic in his head so many times, it stopped feeling like math and started feeling like pain. He had penalty clauses with the plant. He had product at risk in the reefer. He had a driver sleeping in a motel he was paying for. He had another outbound load with nowhere to go, because the dock schedule was already bending around the truck in the mud. By Wednesday evening, he was staring at a number that would gut his winter margins before Christmas even started. That was when he went into Hatcher Marine Supply to make phone calls, and found Malcolm Sweeney at the counter, buying 2 cotter pins and a can of grease. To understand why that mattered, you need to understand who Malcolm was. And what kind of man can still be useful long after everyone else has politely filed him under finished. Malcolm Sweeney was 74 that fall. He had spent most of his working life at the edge of water. Trap skiffs, yard work, breakwater crews, wharf repairs, the kind of labor that teaches a man what holds, and what only looks like it holds. He wasn't an engineer in the credentialed sense. He had no framed certificates. What he had was the kind of practical geometry a harbor teaches a man, if he survives long enough to keep learning from it. He was narrow-shouldered, compact, and bent slightly through the back, not from frailty, but from decades spent leaning over work that fought back. He wore a heavy blue wool sweater under a patched canvas coat. His beard had gone the white of salt left drying on rock. And he spoke quietly enough that people leaned in when they wanted to hear him. Malcolm had one other thing most of Crown Point had forgotten he still owned. Out behind his shed sat a 1942 International TD-18 crawler dozer fitted with an old cargo winch, a machine that had first worked wartime stone along the coast, and had somehow never left the Sweeney family. Malcolm bought it from a harbor contractor in 1958, when everyone else thought it was already too old to justify the trouble. He kept it anyway. Rebuilt injectors, recut bushings, fabricated brackets in his own shop, changed final drive seals with hands that had no business still being steady enough for it. By 1993, the machine was not preserved. It was maintained. Colin knew Malcolm by sight. Everybody did. But he did not know him as a man with an answer. Not for this. Malcolm looked at Colin's face, the face of a man watching money, time, and pride all drain at once, and said, "You're Doyle. Truck at the plant." Colin said yes. Malcolm nodded once. How far off the cap? 8 inches, maybe a little more. How deep? Drives to the housings. Trailer tandems worse. What's beneath it? Fill, then tide mud. Malcolm was quiet for a moment. "I've got something that might fetch you." Colin looked at him the way desperate men look at help they do not believe in, but cannot afford to insult. "What have you got?" "My crawler." Colin gave a tired half-laugh. "Malcolm, Todd Baines has 2 modern recovery rigs, and he's talking about a crane from St. John's." And Malcolm slid the cotter pins into his coat pocket and said, "Your problem isn't power. Your problem is what that power is pushing against." Colin stared at him. Malcolm went on. "Rubber on wet concrete. Outriggers on rotten fill. Straight pull through suction. Every pound they add teaches the mud to keep him." Colin said, "And your crawler changes that how?" Malcolm said, "It bites rock, not slurry. And I won't pull him flat. I'll make the first part of the pull lift." There are moments in a bad week when pride becomes a luxury. Colin had reached that point. He told Malcolm fine. Not because he believed. Because he had run out of respectable alternatives. Malcolm said, "Low tide is best at first light. I'll come then." The next morning, Thursday, the harbor was iron gray, and the wind smelled like cold salt and diesel. Men from the plant had already gathered along the service lane by 7, because news travels fast in small coastal towns. And failure travels fastest of all. Todd Baines was there too. Partly out of professionalism. Partly because recovery men are not built to stay away when a job they couldn't solve is still sitting in public view. Then they heard the crawler before they saw it. Not the high metallic whine of modern hydraulics. A deeper sound. A slow mechanical beat with chain clatter under it. Malcolm came down the access road aboard the TD-18, at little more than walking speed, the machine dark red under patches of rubbed primer and old paint, steel grousers clicking against exposed stone, the winch drum behind him wrapped in cable that looked thick enough to anchor a ferry. Behind the crawler came Malcolm's son Brendan, in a flatbed with shackles, oak blocking, 2 snatch blocks, and a coil of wire rope older than some of the men standing there. No one laughed exactly. But skepticism moved through the crowd in small, visible ways. Folded arms, side glances. The private expressions people wear when they expect to witness a dignified failure. Todd Baines watched the crawler roll in and said to Colin, "That old girl's got bite. I'll give him that. But the numbers still don't like it." Colin said nothing. Malcolm climbed down, walked straight past the crowd, and stood at the harbor edge looking at the Kenworth. He looked at the truck, then at the lane, then past the lane to the old granite slipway that dropped toward the water on the inland side of the plant, then at 2 cast iron mooring bits sunk into older footing near the corner of the loading shed. He spent maybe 4 full minutes doing nothing anybody there would have called action. He turned and said, "Brendan, we anchor on the slip. Double block off those bits. I want the line to arrive high and inland. We're not dragging him out of mud. We're peeling him loose." That was the moment the job changed from spectacle to method. Malcolm did not hurry, which, depending on where Colin's heartbeat was in any given minute, either made him look like a genius, or made Colin want to grab him by the shoulders. They took 40 minutes on the rigging and another 30 checking it. The crawler climbed the granite slipway where rubber tires would have spun. Brendan set blocking where Malcolm wanted it. They ran the winch line through a snatch block at the bit, redirected again, and sent the working pull down to the Kenworth from an angle that would lift slightly toward the lane instead of yanking straight through the suction pocket. Malcolm refused to hook the line to the obvious rear point. He crawled into the mud himself, up to his calves, and had Brendan fasten the shackle. He fixed the rig to a frame point farther forward and lower, then came back coated in Black Harbor muck and said, "If we pull from the wrong place, we bend what we save." Todd Baines's younger operator muttered, "That old man planning to rebuild the truck or rescue it." Todd said, very quietly, "You might want to watch and learn instead." By then even the men from the plant had gone quiet. The tide had turned, not enough to drown the job, but enough to remind every person standing there that water was still part of the argument. Gulls screamed over the waste bins. The reefer unit on the trailer hummed like a clock burning money. At 8:19 Malcolm climbed back onto the TD-18 and sat still with both hands resting on the controls. Brendan later said his father always gave hard pulls a moment before he started. Not as superstition, as discipline. A man who begins too fast usually spends the rest of the job correcting himself. Malcolm eased the clutch in. The cable came taut, then straighter, then rigid. The crawler did not lurch. It leaned into the line. Its steel grousers bit the wet granite and held with a kind of ugly certainty modern machines often disguise beneath comfort and speed. The engine dropped into a slower register, not louder, just deeper, each combustion stroke sounding as though it had all day to win. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the Kenworth shifted, not sideways, not deeper, up, only an inch, maybe less. But the men watching knew exactly what they had seen because the truck's rear suspension rose against the mud instead of settling into it. Malcolm did not add drama. He did not jerk the line. He did not goose the throttle. He let the winch and tracks do what they were geared to do, and kept the pull so even it felt less like force than decision. The harbor mud answered with a sound nobody forgot. Not a splash, not a squelch. A long, wet, tearing groan from under the lane, as if the whole wharf had taken a breath through its teeth. The first suction pocket broke around the drive axles. Black mud belched upward and slid back toward the hole. The trailer shuddered. The reefer rocked once. Then the entire rig moved another 6 inches. You could see the change in the crowd, the way you see weather change on water. Doubt did not disappear all at once. It drained. Todd Baines uncrossed his arms. One plant foreman took off his cap. Brendan kept his eyes on the cable, and said nothing. Malcolm held that same relentless pace. The truck kept coming. The front tractor axle climbed onto firmer surface. The trailer tandems, still buried to their hubs, began to turn, not by power, but by surrender. Dragged through the collapsing pocket Malcolm had forced open with that upward angle. One of the old mooring bits gave a sharp metallic complaint that sent 3 men flinching at once. Malcolm eased off just enough to let the line settle, climbed down, inspected the footing, had Brendan reset a timber pad under the redirect, and climbed back on. No speech, no theater, just correction. At 8:57, the biggest movement came. The trailer broke free of the deepest hold with a violent wet gasp, lurched a foot and a half toward the lane, and rose enough for daylight to show beneath one mud-caked tire. A man near the shed said, "Sweet Lord," to no one in particular. Malcolm kept pulling. At 9:06, The Kenworth and trailer were both back on the service lane, listing slightly, smeared in black mud, 2 tires ruined, 1 fender twisted, but intact, upright, and free. 40,000 pounds of cod, still cold in the box. Engine still good. Frame still true. Schedule wounded, but not dead. Malcolm idled the crawler down until the engine settled into a heavy slow beat, then shut it off. The silence that followed had weight in it. Not because nobody had words, because the right words arrive late, when a room full of certainty has just been proven second-rate by an old man in salt-stiff wool. Colin walked to Malcolm, while Brendan started coiling cable. Colin was not a sentimental man. He had built his company by being faster than excuses and harder than setbacks. But his voice, when it came out, was carrying more than one thing in it. "How did you know?" Malcolm looked from Colin to the truck, to the wet line of harbor muck left across the lane. He said, "Because the mud told the same story the tide always tells. It wasn't beating your truck with weight, it was keeping it with shape. Todd was pulling through the pocket. I pulled him out of it." Colin said, "Todd had more machine than you." Malcolm shook his head once. "He had more rating than me. Different thing. I had stone under my tracks, and time enough not to lie to the problem. Todd Baines had come over by then." He stood with his hands on his hips and looked at the TD-18 the way a proud man looks at something that has just forced him to become more honest. "I thought I was watching the recovery," he said. "Turns out I was watching rigging." Malcolm's mouth moved at one corner. "Mostly that's what recovery is." Colin tried to pay him that morning. Malcolm refused. He tried again that evening. Malcolm refused again. On Saturday Colin drove to the Sweeney place with an envelope and left it on the kitchen table while Malcolm was out behind the shed. Malcolm's wife May found it, opened it, saw the amount, and carried it to him. Malcolm read the note, folded it once, and told her to take it into town and put it toward the Volunteer Lifeboat Fund. He never mentioned it to Colin. Colin never mentioned it either. But the story got loose. First in the plant, then in the supply store, then in the diner, then in every harbor, where men still cared about whether a thing worked more than whether it looked current. And because real stories do not travel as information so much as judgment, the story changed people. Colin changed first. Not instantly. Real lessons rarely arrive as conversion. They arrive as irritation, then memory, then habit. He started keeping hardwood blocking on every long run. He started teaching his drivers that ground condition matters before horsepower ever gets invited into the conversation. He paid for rigging training the next spring. He stopped mocking older equipment just because newer sales brochures spoke louder. Most of all, he started listening harder when quiet men explained a problem in fewer words than seemed impressive. Malcolm Sweeney kept the TD-18 working for another 12 years. He did not restore it into beauty. He kept it in readiness. A restored machine is often trying to remember the past. A maintained machine is waiting for the next call. He died in 2006 at 87. At Malcolm's funeral, Brendan said his father had taught him that patience was not the absence of urgency. It was disciplined refusal to do the fast wrong thing when a slow right thing was still available. Colin Doyle was there in the 4th row, thinking not about business, not about fish, not even about money, but about Malcolm stepping into harbor mud to move a shackle 6 inches because 6 inches was the difference between saving a truck and wrecking one. And years later, the story proved it had not ended with Malcolm at all. In March of 2018, after a week of freeze-thaw rain, a contractor named Evan Pike buried a 20-ton excavator beside a salt marsh access road while trying to place armor stone for a washout repair west of town. He tried to self-recover with another machine, and buried that one too. The wrecker from Clarenville took one look at the shoulder and said he could return in 3 days with mats and a bigger crane. Brendan Sweeney stood on the road looking at the mess and said to his son Liam, "Go wake the International." Liam was 30 that year. He had grown up around the TD-A team, the way boys grow up around certain family truths. Not by being formally lectured, but by absorbing the fact that some things in the shed matter more than the things with better paint. He brought the crawler out at dawn. Same winch, same deep steel bite, same ugly patient sound. Evan Pike looked at the machine and made the same mistake Colin Doyle had made 25 years earlier. He saw age first and usefulness second. Brendan let him make that mistake. Then he showed Liam where to place the blocks, where to redirect the line, how to read which ground was lying and which ground was holding. They took almost an hour rigging. Liam made the pull. The excavator came out. Then the second machine. No drama, no miracle, just old knowledge, applied without apology. When Evan Pike asked what he owed, Brendan told him nothing. That, too, survived intact across generations. The TD-18 still sits in the Sweeney shed today under salt-stained rafters and a roof Liam keeps patching because the machine matters more to him than clean lumber does. The dealer in St. John's told the family twice that it was a relic, that parts were impractical, that they'd be better off selling it to a collector, or putting it in a museum where people could admire it without expecting anything from it. The Sweeneys heard him out politely and changed nothing. Because the machine is not really the point. The point is the mind behind it. The point is knowing the difference between a straight pull and the useful one. The point is understanding that mud, tide, concrete, timber, stone, and steel are not background details. They are the job. The point is that the world keeps creating problems that cannot be bullied, only understood. That Thursday in 1993 taught Colin Doyle something he spent the rest of his working life trying to deserve. Newer is not the same as truer. Bigger is not the same as better. And the loudest answer in sight is often just the most expensive way to misunderstand what is really happening under your feet. Somewhere out along that coast, on a cold morning no different from the one Malcolm worked in, another man will eventually stand over a machine or a truck or a load that has settled where it should not have settled. He will do the fast math. He will feel the panic. He will call the obvious help first. Maybe that help will work. Maybe it won't. But if it doesn't, and if there is still one family somewhere nearby stubborn enough to keep old iron alive for the exact kind of day everyone else has forgotten, then sooner or later he will hear a slower engine coming down the road. He will see steel grousers instead of rubber. He will see somebody who is not in a hurry. He will hear very few words.
If he is lucky, he will learn the same lesson Colin learned with 40,000 pounds of cod, sinking into harbor mud, while the tide waited to make everything worse. The ground does not care what your equipment cost. The water does not care how new your machine is. The problem does not care what the brochure promised. It only cares whether you understand what it is.